Week 10 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first kicker, Michael Badgley of the Indianapolis Colts. Badgley surprisingly out there in 56% of fantasy leagues. This Colts offense, one of the best offenses in the league, even though the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 9 shut this offense down for the majority of the game till garbage time. But Badgley, he's on a big offense. He's got a good boot, hitting 250-plus yarders in the Week 9 game at the Steelers. And like I said, surprisingly out there in 56% of leagues. The last few weeks for Badgley, Week 6 versus Arizona 8, Week 7 at the Chargers 4, Week 8 versus Tennessee 9, and Week 9 at the Steelers 12 fantasy points. So Week 10, a good matchup back home indoors in Indianapolis, where obviously their offense is better this season. Indoors is always a plus, obviously, where you don't got to deal with outside elements, with all those factors, and a good matchup versus the Falcons that give up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Badgley definitely an ad this week. Next kicker, Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks. So Jason Myers, it's been a solid season for him once again. He's out there in tons of fantasy leagues, and 72% is Jason Myers, and he's on a high-powered offense more weeks than not. 4 out of 5 games, 9 or more fantasy points for Jason Myers. So Week 10, a good matchup versus the Cardinals. Give up the 10th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And Myers has been one of the more accurate kickers in the league over the last 2 seasons. Week 4 at Arizona 14, Week 5 versus Tampa 4, Week 6 at Jacksonville 10, Week 7 versus Houston 10, and then Week 9 at the Commanders in the blowout victory, 9 fantasy points. So like I said, 40, 50 yards ain't a problem for him. I know a lot of extra points of late he's been getting his Jason Myers, but like I said, anytime a kicker's in a high-powered offense, opportunities are going to be there, and that kicker should be owned in most 12-team leagues and deep. This kicker, Will Richard of the Minnesota Vikings. Richard, he's out there in tons of fantasy leagues right now, and he's pretty much on this waiver wire list weekly out there in 85% of fantasy leagues. He's in an offense that could score the football. Week 9, they needed to put a lot of points on the board, and they did to get the victory at the Lions. And Richard, 2 out of 3 games now with double-digit fantasy points. Week 7 versus the Eagles, 18. Week 8 at the Chargers, 6. And Week 9 at the Lions, 11. So this week, like I said, a good matchup versus the Ravens. Give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Another indoor game back home for this Minnesota Viking team, which obviously is always a plus. So with those factors and Richard, 50-plus yards, he's a solid kicker with a big boot. Definitely an ad. This week, next kicker, Cam Little of the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's been a struggle majority of the season for Cam Little, but we saw him hit a 68-yarder, the longest field goal of all time, even though in preseason he did hit a 70-yarder. So Cam Little, unlimited range, obviously, to hit it 68 yards and still had room to spare where he could have hit it another 5-6 yards. It would have been good from was Cam Little. That's impressive, obviously. And this Jaguar team, that could be down Brian Thomas. He's banged up now at the end of that game in the matchup in Vegas, where they might have to settle for more field goals. And like I said, anytime you got a kicker that could kick it from that distance, he's going to put up fantasy points, even though, like I said, he's been struggling a majority of the season, is Cam Little. So Week 10, a matchup for Houston, where their defense is a bend but don't break unit. Another indoor game as well, which is always a plus. So with those factors, Cam Little coming off, obviously, the longest field goal of all time, definitely a kicker there this week, and he's available in 90% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Cairo Santos of the Chicago Bears. So this Bear offense, very high-powered this season, and obviously with the offensive mind, like Ben Johnson, who was the offensive coordinator for many seasons with the Detroit Lions, and we've seen the damage that offense has done. He's brought it over here to Chicago, and they're putting a lot of points on the board. So Cairo Santos, he missed a few weeks in Week 6, Week 7, but the last 2 weeks back now, double-digit fantasy points in both those games. Week 8 at Baltimore, 11. Week 9 at the Bengals, 10. And Week 10 here, a great matchup versus the Giants that can't stop anyone and give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So Cairo Santos, he's been a great kicker for many seasons. Obviously started his career with the Kansas City Chiefs, but now he's been with the Bears many seasons, and someone they have confidence in, and someone who could kick that football, especially in a tough, obviously, home field like Soldier Field with heavy winds and bad weather in these later weeks of the season. So with those factors, Santos a good ad, and he's available right now with 92% of fantasy weeks. That's a few kickers I looked at off the wire for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.